Hi everyone, so today's video presentation is going to be an example of the UKSCA case study I delivered when I passed the case study part of my assessment a couple of years ago. For context, there are several things that I would change now as my knowledge and experience has been advanced, but I will mention these as I'm going through the presentation. For those of you who aren't familiar with the UKSCA or the case study, the UKSCA is the governing body for strength and conditioning in this country, and the case study is one of 4 different parts of the whole accreditation process in order to become a recognized strength and conditioning coach. So without further ado, let's get started. So the athlete I was working with at the time, his name was Mo. His sport was football, and he was currently unattached. The goal of the program was to be able to get him into a physical shape where he could be able to gain a semi-professional contract. So the idea for me, or the thought behind the program, was to make sure that there were no physical limitations that were holding him back from doing this. From a strength and conditioning perspective, he had no gym experience, and injury-wise, injured his left ankle 3 years ago. So the UKSCA case study starts with a needs analysis of the sport. So you're telling the assessor what the demands of the sport are from a biomechanical, physiological, and strength and conditioning perspective. So in football, there are repeated changes of direction, so you need to be efficient in producing force in all planes. Now, if this video works, then one of my main criticisms of my case study at the time, so hopefully this sound won't be too loud.
Green. Purple.
So again, key criticisms here. If you're working with athletes, do not make them touch a cone. One, it puts their focus somewhere where it doesn't be. Nobody should be looking down at their feet when they're changing direction. Secondly, if an athlete is not responding to a stimulus on the floor, like a cone, then don't have them do this. It just throws off change of direction mechanics massively. And to be brutally honest, whilst myself and the athlete enjoyed this session and I thought I was doing a good job at the time, it doesn't work for so many reasons. If I was to do this again, I would work on the basic technique of, for example, an outside foot cut, and then gradually introduce more sport specific stimulus. So I'd strip this right back, work with the physical stimulus, or work with the sort of physical output first, and then once you've mastered that skill, I would slowly start to integrate this into gameplay. I would also look to work with the athlete's technical coach to see where they felt the change of direction was appropriate to integrate into the sport itself. What you can't see, unfortunately, because the picture's in the way, is just the athlete performing a hang clean and looking for triple extension. So that's simply, have you got a straight line between the ankles, which are extending, the knees, which are expanding, and the hip, which is extending. So as a striker, if we're looking at sport-specific or position-specific time motion analysis, strikers' sprints tend to be longer, which again hints at the fact that we might need to have longer sprints in our training program to make sure that the hamstrings are conditioned to high-speed running. And as I said, some change of direction work where appropriate. Again, strength is going to underpin a lot of these qualities, and in the context of the program we were doing at the time, I felt like the biggest bang for our buck lay within the striker's strength. In terms of the physiology for football, whilst there is a primary reliance on the aerobic system, it's also important to note that it is not the average intensity of the game that players will struggle with. If you look at, well, I'm just going to use myself as an example. When I play five-a-side and I keep my Fitbit on, I might cover a couple of miles in the space of an hour, but obviously the heart rate is through the roof. So you still need to get players fast, you still need to get them strong, you still need to condition them to the point where they can repeat this quality. You cannot endure a quality that you don't have, so build speed in the first place, then learn to endure it. Obviously, you can't ignore the contribution of the aerobic system, but if you can run all day but you can't get to the ball first, it doesn't matter how well conditioned you are at a reasonably high intensity. You need to get to the ball first, you need to work acceleration, you need to have some kind of hamstring conditioning in there in the form of maximum velocity sprinting. Again, because the aerobic system does contribute so much, it is very important for us to have a footballers have a well-developed aerobic system, but again, there are also intense actions in the game that we need to condition our footballer for. In terms of injury analysis, hamstrings are obviously quite common in football, as are ankle sprains and knee ligament injuries. The most appropriate way of conditioning for hamstring strains, again, this could be a topic in itself, but you're going to use a combination of knee and hip dominant exercises. You're going to have some element of eccentric work in there, so whether that's RDLs, Nordics. You need to make sure you're managing their load, especially their high intensity sprints where possible, and including some element of jumping and landing so that the ankles are well conditioned to deal with this. And ideally this work is done in multiple planes, because if a footballer's jumping up for a header and say they get nudged in the air and that forces them to twist or turn, their ankles and the rest of their body need to be able to deal with these forces. And again, having strong quadriceps relative to weak hamstrings has been shown as a risk factor. So we want hamstrings that are not just long, but they're strong at these end ranges as well. This is where exercises like Nordics and hamstring sliders have received a lot of traction in the last couple of years, because we want that strength at end range and we want the ability of the hamstring to control rapid decelerations. From a strength and conditioning perspective, we want to focus on eccentric hamstring strength and the ability of the athlete to sense where their ankle is in time and space. So is this video going to work? Okay, so here
Left.
we have just simple rotational landings.
He's out.
Again, working with what we had access to at the time. So these
Right.
are where we did our sessions. Can you control where the ankle is in time and space? Can you reduce force before you learn to produce it? And again, we need to do this in all directions. So what did our assessment tell us? So these are very brief descriptions. I'm going to go on to more detailed in the next slide. So what were the elephants in the room that we needed to focus on, and what were the mice or the not so important factors? So hip flexors were tight, which were inhibiting his glutes, and hamstrings were also weak. So posterior chain not very powerful, which again will lead into the poor power scores and strength scores that you'll see on the next page. Upper body was poor, but again, as a footballer, whilst the body is one piece, and we did focus on the upper body, as a footballer, for me, what was going to have the biggest impact on his game was hammering his posterior chain. Trunk strength was also poor. Remember getting him to do a push-up when we first started working together before this assessment, and he said to me, but I'm a footballer, I've never been pushed off the ball, why do I need to be able to do a press-up? But of course, the body is one piece, and a press-up is a good reflection that someone has the upper body stability and control, as well as reflexive core stabilization. So obviously we compare the testing battery to what data is out there in the literature. Depending on what sport you're using, so football's an easy one because there's a lot of literature written on it. These standardized norms may not be as readily apparent for other tests. So we were comparing him with the Norwegian national team with the maximal aerobic speed in meters per second. Interestingly, this study from Tonneson showed the differences between Division 1, 2 and 3 players in the Norwegian league as well as the national team. Basically found that as you go further up the leagues, your ability to your aerobic system even, or your maximal aerobic speed gets better. So in order to play the game at a higher level, you need to be able to complete more, cover more distance while still remaining aerobic. Data is coming from other different papers. So for example, the 200 kilo half squat for a 75 male footballer. Again, don't know that many footballers who are able to do that in this country, but that's neither here nor there. And as you can see, he's well below the strength scores, the power scores. As a colleague of mine pointed out as well, the all-girls school that I work at the moment, the only girls who are jumping this poorly on a single leg are girls who've had ACL injuries. So it's also, being weak is just a good predictor of the chance you could be at risk of an injury. So again, we've measured assessments for what is important to his sport. Lower body power, as we said, being able to produce this in multiple planes, off single leg, double leg. Strength underpins power massively, so it's important to have some kind of strength metric in there. I would say 1RM testing a novice athlete is not a good idea. In reality, in my opinion, if you've got an athlete's 5RM going up, they're stronger. even if you pick something like an 8RM, not technically strength, but in my mind they're stronger. I had some awkward questions in relation to what quality I was going after, so probably best to stick with something like a 3RM, and I'll explain that awkward conversation or those tricky questions in a second. So the summary of the findings was that he had a low level of muscular capacity. This is a fancy word for saying local muscular endurance. Obviously, strength is an important factor, but if you're tolerating repetitive loading in a sport, so using football as an example, if you're unable to tolerate repetitive loading of the calf and ankle complex, you're increasing your risk of something like an ankle sprain. Same goes for hamstrings and strains. So we wanted to improve his basic movement competency, and we wanted to improve his local muscular endurance or his muscular capacity. Posterior chain, so hamstrings and glutes were a big factor in order for us to take him from point A, which is him being pretty weak, not very explosive, and not very good local muscular endurance, to point B, where he's a lot more powerful, a lot more explosive, and improves his maximal aerobic speed. DuPont's 2002 paper showed that speeds at or above 100% maximal aerobic speed were key to improving aerobic power. Not that it's relevant to this assessment, so to speak, but when you're at lower intensity, so stuff around about the 60% mark, that's when volume becomes more critical to the adaptation. But we wanted him to be able to travel at a faster speed while still utilizing his aerobic system. So that's why we went for speeds at or above his maximal aerobic speed. Eccentric hamstring exercises and were included as well. As I mentioned, this eccentric hamstring strength is a predictor of the likelihood of hamstring injury. So this is what the plan looked like. So again, phase 1, looking for local muscular endurance and to lay some kind of foundation for his maximum aerobic speed. Buffering capacity is simply the ability to recover between high intensity efforts and buffer lactate. Again, in hindsight, not really sure why I thought this was appropriate for a footballer. Obviously, if you have high intensity efforts in a game, you need to recover from them. Is football a lactate sport? Not really. Obviously, if all the players going down your specific part of the pitch and you need to, for example, a high intensity 30-second burst, yeah, possibly. In hindsight, don't think it was as appropriate a method as it probably could have been. I, in hindsight, would have gone for some kind of aerobic work whilst also either working speed in a previous block or maybe some repeated speed type stuff, which will still be massively taxing on the cardiovascular system. Again, we deloaded into his trial period. You're probably going to want to show that you've prepped for a certain event. State the goals clearly. Is there a competition coming up? It's probably a good idea to have one coming up in the 12-week block that you cover. Doesn't have to be 12 weeks, but that's the minimum they want. The longer the duration of the case study, the more chance you're giving yourself, because it shows your sort of versatility. Don't do what I did and then have to come and get all this data or these timings retrospectively. So I had a couple of weeks here and there where I was like, crap, I've got no programming for this athlete. What on earth happened? Make sure you track everything. If you can manage, if you've got some kind of load monitoring tool going on, put that in there as well. Make sure you're really clear on the adaptations that you are going for in each phase. Good friend of mine failed his case study simply for stating he was going after core strength when they were doing planks and weighted planks, which were about a minute in duration, and the assessor just said at that sort of time scale it's not really strength that's the limiting factor. So be super specific with your adaptation you're going for, make it really, really obvious. So again, going into phase 1 for me laid the foundation. So local muscular endurance laid the foundation for then obviously introducing heavier loads. Had a deload and then retested his strength. Again, the UKSCA case study is one of those things where it might not be appropriate to test strength in season in the context of your athlete, but you're going to need to show you've reassessed it. And ideally, I would have, as well as the adaptation, what you're going for, have some form of metric that you're using to highlight that the adaptation that you are going after has actually taken place. If you can, it's worth having evidence from the sport itself. So you may well say, yeah, I got him stronger, yeah, he's jumping more, but you need to have some kind of evidence, ideally, of how that is impacting on their sport. So as an example, I've shown data that states that the higher up in footballing levels you go, the higher the meters per second traveled by footballers is. So again, this is a good way of me saying I'm improving his ability to execute the technique or the tactics of the game. I can't remember the reference off the top of my head, but I've definitely come across literature that says that the higher a footballer's maximal aerobic speed is, the more sprints per game they are able to do, and the more touches of the ball they get. Anything that can make it obvious that what you're doing links into the sport is definitely preferred. Don't just assume that because you've improved strength, power, whatever, that the assessor will accept this. So this was breaking it down to a weekly structure. Again, having some loose kind of overview is definitely important, and to show that you are not just able to write a good strength and conditioning plan on paper, but you know how to amend things based in and around the athlete's training. So when we were in a pre-season phase, we were using both gym-based sessions and field-based sessions. The home program I gave him, which now I look back on, I think is dull as dishwater, and I would almost laugh someone out of the building for writing it, for reasons I'll go on to explain. But we wanted to improve basic capacity. So capacity tests we used were stuff like calf raises, single leg hip lifts with the foot on the bench as a measure of hamstring capacity, trunk tests, so leg lowers, side plank, isolated muscular conditioning basically, and I had data to basically state what level he should have been at, or ideally should have been at, compared to other athletes who are of a reasonably good standard. Robustness is a funny term. I came across a nice definition on Instagram, and it was saying about the ability for an athlete to resist large changes in stimuli. So for example, if you've played back-to-back games or 2 games in a week, whatever, how well does your body avoid going into overdrive, so to speak, or how effectively can you handle these changes in load? And robustness, again, one of those terms, it can mean a lot of different things to a lot of different people. Whatever you use in your case study, make sure you define what that term means to you and why you've defined it as that. Because, as an example, if you had comments from the technical coach of, say, a boxer, and the technical coach said, I want my boxer to be stronger, he probably doesn't mean I want his back squat and deadlift and bench press to go up. He probably means he wants the boxer to not be thrown around when he's in the clinch. So clarify anything you're saying. If you've got stuff from the technical coach, definitely put it in there, because they will almost certainly ask. So that's worth keeping in mind. We use bodyweight circuits and that local muscular endurance as the foundation for strength. In my mind, you build stability first. This isn't us just talking about being on a BOSU ball. It's about local muscular endurance and how easy it is to fatigue that muscle. Then you build strength, then you build power. Again, it doesn't have to be in that linear process. You might find an athlete, for example, has done years of press-ups or whatever, and their upper body stability is good, and they can move on to an upper body strength phase, but their lower body still requires a little bit more local muscular conditioning. Again, whatever you think is appropriate. So, like I said, this was his pre-season, and we had markers with his maximal aerobic speed. We had assessments of his movement competency in the form of an overhead squat and single leg squats. So again, making sure, if you're saying it's important, did you measure it? Have you improved it? So again, onto that home program that now just makes me cringe and want to curl up and die. Again, one of those things works well on paper. In hindsight, I look at week 8 and I'm like, 22 Bulgarian split squats like on each leg, 44 split squats per round. You're doing that 3 times. That's like 132 split squats. Like, just not only logistically not feasible, because that session is now 8 times as long as the first one or whatever it was, but I probably could have just picked a more difficult exercise, even if it was something like, I don't know, a rear for elevated split squat and a front for elevated split squat, and then the knee just goes close to the ground, so you've increased range of motion. Yes, luckily, obviously the idea behind this home program was increased muscular capacity or local muscular endurance, so it makes sense that the reps are quite high. But again, I look at this and it's, for me, dull as dishwater. And also it assumes that the training process is just linear, which anyone who's worked in sport knows that it's not. Linear programs are awesome for beginners, super simple to understand, but eventually you'll probably get to a point where you can't just keep progressing up and up and up. So again, with something like leg lowers, I think when we initially tested him, he probably couldn't do any, or I took that out for time reasons. Not entirely sure why now looking back on it, but again, you're gonna need something that works logistically but also has a scientific rationale. Again, make sure you are aware of the logistics when you talk through your program, because initially when I came to draft my program up, I was like, why is he taking a couple of weeks off here and there? And then I realized why it was. But obviously if you haven't presented it before and there's weeks missing, and then you're like, I don't know what the athlete was doing then, it doesn't look good. So make sure you've backed that up and you know exactly what's gone on week to week and you've got the dates, etc. So this is an example preseason session. Again, I quite like Dan John's, so that's another strength coach in America. I quite like his phrase that the warm-up is the workout, in that if something's important, you're going to do it and you're going to disguise it as a warm-up. So for example, we've got local muscular conditioning hitting the lower body. So we've got hamstrings, glutes, adductors, core, and just basic movements with the goblet squat to press. And again, building some pretty good capacity here. Front squats are just a strength movement, the idea being that we're going to take him into cleans later on in the program, so we want him to front squat and just get him to land, and also focusing on an eccentric hamstring stress. He wasn't good enough to do string that many chin-ups together, so we went for chin-up lowers, and then obviously just some basic trunk work to finish off with. This is when we tried peaking him for the trial. So with the 2 minutes on, 1 minute off sessions down the bottom here. So that's taken from David Bishop's work, which found that 70 to 80% of VO2 max was the sweet spot for improving buffering capacity, so improving the ability to get rid of lactate. Interestingly, the paper that's taken from also says that they trialed higher intensities than this, and actually above a certain intensity was actually detrimental to the ability to clear lactate. I would definitely recommend checking that paper out, as there's a lot of highly practical take-homes in there. In regards to the 10 seconds on, 3 minutes off, that would have just been pure speed training. Again, make sure that you've got references, and again, make sure you've got some kind of context. So for example, I wasn't programming his stuff with Middlesex University, but that worked nicely because it coached the lifts and it meant that he was more familiar with them when we came to doing them. Even little things like a weekly schedule. So for example, now I look back on it, him doing sprints the day after football, not ideal. He's going to be in a fatigued state. Again, think through everything. It probably makes more sense to have an idea that you're going to use an athlete for a UKSCA case study rather than training an athlete for 12 weeks and thinking, oh, I'll use this as my case study, because it will make you think a lot harder about certain things that you've organized into the training. So this was a peaking for trial phase. Again, we progressed from, if it'll just let me flick back a couple of slides, maybe it will, maybe it won't. Okay, not available during recording, no problem. So we'd gone from stuff with body weights, so split squats, lateral lunges, dead bugs, to now using a barbell. So now we've got overhead squat, some more compound type movements, which are less about isolated muscular conditioning and more about just getting the reps in. So we're slowly building up a tolerance. We've got some single leg work in there, which the single leg movement assessments, a single leg squat, showed that they were important. So this was a real sticking point when I first presented my case study. The assessor asked me what I meant by strength volume, and the honest answer is we used a bastardized version of the Russian squat cycle. We had 6 weeks where he basically didn't have, the trial didn't go to plan, then there was 6 weeks until a potential another trial. So I just said, right, you're not training for football at the moment, So let's take this opportunity to lay down some serious strength foundations. If you can knock up a volume load chart, do this as you're going. Don't do what I did and then think, oh Christ, 5.5s at 95 kilos is kind of the same at 6.4s at 100 kilos. Again, doesn't work very well when you're doing it retrospectively. The loading was much heavier than our general prep phase, where we were looking at more local muscular endurance. So explain the rationale behind your programming. If you've got some kind of marker of volume and intensity, that's going to be useful. Again, if you look at the program, it looks like we've built in from week 1 to 4, then we've backed off in week 5 and 6. We built from weeks 1 to 4, had a deload in week 5, and then in week 6 we strength tested him, so that explains why the volumes come down there. This is an example of the strength volume session. The reason why I was so pressed on it was because the assessor was like, what adaptation are you going for with strength volume? Now, I was, as I said, using a bastardized Russian squat cycle program. I was mixing in front and back squats. The reason being was, to be brutally honest, I was doing the program for him without the idea that it was going to UKSCA accreditation, and I eventually wanted to take him onto cleans, and in hindsight, I have no idea how they let me get away with back squats and front squats in the same session, but that was my rationale. For those of you who don't know the Russian squat cycle, Google it. It's a pretty brutal program if you can put yourself through it. Definitely wouldn't recommend doing it in season for an athlete. It's just going to be too much intensity for them. But anyway, in the Russian squat cycle, eventually they build up to 6 sixes at 80%. So 6 reps is technically not quite strength, and I think that's what the assessor wasn't quite happy with, because strength volume to him wasn't an adaptation. He said, my argument was that we retested his 1RMs, they went up, therefore he's stronger. He's taking a weight that he could only do for 2 reps previously, and now he's doing it for 6. He's stronger. But again, be super hot on your definitions, on your adaptations. Unfortunately, you probably need to err more on the sciencey side than of just logic. Like for me, going from lifting a weight for 2 reps to lifting a weight for 6 reps, that for me shows you're stronger, or something's improved somewhere that's good. But it was a real sticking point. And again, some more compound movements in this program. Again, at the time we were using handstand walk-ups mainly as a little bit of fun, but there's a bit of anti-extension and some upper body work. But again, saying you chuck something in there for a bit of fun probably won't cut the mustard. Make sure you've got some kind of scientific, dare I say, reasoning for being in there. Final phase was strength and power. So we kept the heavy strength work in, as strength is the foundation to power. And we had 3 weeks on, 1 week off, or at least that was the intention. But then he couldn't make one of the sessions, so it kind of got in the way of that. So again, make sure you are clear on your dates and timings. If you say that he was ill, the athlete was ill 1 week, I'm sure they'll be fine with it, as long as you can then justify what's happened in between. But don't turn up and think, oh God, I don't know what he did for that week. And again, we focused on the ability to resist triple flexion. So for example, I had him do a hang power clean and then basically a stiff catch. So slamming on the brakes, working on eccentric strength. This is an example of phase 4. So we've got hang power clean, which is obviously power with a reasonably heavy load, and then standing long jump, which is obviously power work with just your own body weight. So again, surfing the force velocity curve, still got an element of muscular capacity in there, and we also kept up the robustness circuits. On a side note, ignoring the UKSCA accreditation for a second, I love using movement circuits as warm-up stuff. It's a great way of disguising a low-level conditioning and tolerance to barbell work, especially if the athlete's ready for it. And it also just gives a new athlete so many chances to practice movements, which I think as coaches we often forget, or we often don't give athletes chances to learn. In terms of adaptation, it's easy to be like, oh, you've got 3 10s on there, it's muscular hypertrophy or it's endurance. It might not be if the load's that light, it's just practicing the movements. So this was the testing battery pre and post. So make it easy for the assessor to know what's got better and what hasn't. I've highlighted in red what fell below the standards, and I also had research papers as to why I'd set the standards where I'd set them. Again, if you can compare this to athletes in the specific sport, then this will obviously be useful. It's probably not much good saying you've decided that, I don't know, 30 seconds is the standard side plank because you just feel like 30 is a round number. Have some kind of rationale behind it. If you want the standards of the muscular capacity circuit, or where I've got those from, drop me an email, todd.davidson2011@gmail.com. Happy to ping this to you. Balls can't go back. So basically, he improved in metrics for strength, power, and maximum aerobic speed, which again have been shown to be key qualities in footballers. If I show, hopefully this will work. Don't know how loud this is.
5.
So if you watch the knees are bouncing 4. In on a couple of reps. You can see the in one of the videos
2.
that I took from around the side, the ankle clasps in as well. This is the post video, so notice the knees don't move.
3, 2, 1.
Able to maintain vision. Also did single leg squat assessments, which I definitely think are worthwhile. Check out the NASM performance enhancement specialist books on screening and what muscles might be tight or weak and how this might affect your programming. But yeah, if you're saying movement competency is improved, you kind of need to evidence that. So monitoring and evaluation. So this was just something we used to basically check how the athlete was feeling and strengthen the coach-athlete relationship in terms of the sessions with me and away from me. What's gone good? What could be better? How are you going to make it better? So getting the athlete used to self-reflecting. So I presented this case study to, I think, 4 different people, each of them who had different criticisms or critique of the work. So as an example, somebody suggested that there was no transverse plane work in there, so no rotational work in there. When I said this as a future recommendation, when I presented to the assessor then said, but then that increases the volume of work that you're doing, which obviously it does, but be prepared for questions that are either meant to assess your ability to back yourself or that probably just come across as awkward. Make sure you thought through how you might question it if it was delivered to you, or try and get a fresh pair of eyes to look at your presentation. Ideally someone who is going to be honest with you, who's not going to bullshit you, and who is going to give you feedback that you need to prepare you in order for what's about to come. So one of the reflections I had was that I assessed him on a single leg, and I noticed that single leg was where we really saw the movement errors come to fruition, but then I didn't really do that much single leg work. So that was one of my reflections. In terms of improving stretch shortening cycle, the gym that we were based in, the ceilings were really low, so they had plyo boxes, but you'd hit your head on the ceiling if you used them, so we didn't use them that much. But yeah, just stuff like low-level ankling drills, low-level foot contact drills, that sort of thing. It's really difficult in the future recommendations to not completely slate yourself to the point where the assessor's like, well, why didn't you just do that then if you realised it was an issue? But also showing that you appreciate what could be better moving forwards and that you're aware and you've self-reflected and you've got data to obviously prove this. So thank you for listening. Really appreciate it. If anyone wants me to just or a second pair of eyes to look over their case study, more than happy to do it. Again, I was lucky enough to present to 4 different people and pass first time, so happy to provide advice or happy to play devil's advocate with a case study. So drop me an email, todd.davidson2011@gmail.com, inbox me on Facebook, whatever you prefer. Make sure you've got a reference list. They're not going to be happy with you just saying, oh, well, I read somewhere on Instagram that this guy did this study. You're going to need proper references. They're not going to look at them realistically, but make sure they're on there. Obviously, these guys are going to be well read. So they may well have had papers out on the stuff themselves. Make sure that you've make sure you're not walking into that if they have. This was obviously a study that showed that higher meters per second was also correlated to the level that you were playing at. If my memory serves correctly, I think we got him up to a 4.83 meters per second maximum aerobic speed, which, as I said at the start of the presentation, we're looking to remove physical limitations in his game. And for me, if I can show he's fitter, faster, stronger than, say, an international footballer, I've done my job. So yeah, this is just reference to show that. Again, he's fitter, or in terms of maximal aerobic speed anyway, than Norwegian national team, so always good evidence. And again, this was just on the repeated sprint test, which we didn't do. Further detail on the corrective side of things, or the movement assessment, shall I say, should it be needed. Again, if you're in doubt, again, you haven't got that much time, chuck this sort of stuff after the presentation, because if they ask you, then you've got this to refer back to. If they ask you and you're sort of stumbling on your words, doesn't look great.